Hi friends, it's great to be back at the Aspen Ideas Festival. What a year it's been, 16 months actually. As you can see, I'm here in person. Those of you who are watching, you're not. And that's good and bad. It's bad because it's better when we're all together. We know that. It makes us happier. It gives us a sense of physical community. But here's the good news. There are a lot more people that can share ideas with the virtual Aspen Ideas Festival than ever could before. And in point of fact, we're learning all sorts of new ways to share ideas, to share experiences, to share the relationships that we have with each other in the new virtual world. We're making the best of it. We'll be back together in person next year, but who knows? Maybe this kind of format will stick around so the people who can't be here can be here. I want to talk to you today about all the things that we've learned over the past year, the pain that we've experienced, and maybe what we can learn from that pain, how we can come out of the coronavirus epidemic happier, better, stronger, more resilient than we went in. Now, when I think about this idea of getting better through adversity, I think often about my mother-in-law. She was caught as a little girl in the Spanish Civil War. Her father was a surgeon for the side that lost the Spanish Civil War, who subsequently spent many years in prison. So she grew up in poverty. At the age of 21, she moved to Barcelona and married my father-in-law, a marriage that turned out not to be very happy. As a matter of fact, he left soon after his children were born with another woman. This is not an unusual story. It's happened all throughout history. So it's not an uncommon tragedy, but it's a trauma nonetheless. My father-in-law didn't pay child support. It was hard on them. Recently, my beloved mother-in-law, who's now 92, and I were discussing this, and she said, that was the worst time of my life. And she thought about it a little bit, and she said, and it was the best time of my life. I said, what are you talking about? How can it be the worst and the best at the same time? She said, because had it not been for that terrible time, I wouldn't have become the person that I am. You see, after my father-in-law left and she had to take care of her kids, she had to be resilient. There were no choices. She went to college. She became a teacher. She became the person that she turned into, somebody fully alive with her own friends, with her own life, with her own profession. Because it turns out that what my mother-in-law was talking about is a great phenomenon in my field of social science. It's a phenomenon that we call post-traumatic growth. Now, you hear all the time about post-traumatic stress. We talk about it constantly, and it's no joke. I mean, people suffer when they deal with traumas. But here's the good news. Most of the time, people in the long run experience something called post-traumatic growth, which has amazing benefits. When you deal with pain and sacrifice and you really lean into it and you learn from it, you can expect a number of very tangible benefits. Most people who have post-traumatic growth, which is more than half of people who suffer from trauma at the end of the day, they find that their relationships deepen, their friendships are better, they savor the relationships in their life more than they ever did before. They think less, they care less about what other people think of them. They're more resilient to future trauma. Virtually everybody who goes through post-traumatic growth becomes more philosophically adroit, more spiritually adept. They understand what is more transcendent to their own narrow existence better than they did before. These are the benefits that we get. These are the benefits that my mother-in-law got. I can think back on my life of the things that really went wrong. These are some of the benefits that I've gotten. So let's think to ourselves, what can we get as we come out of this year along these lines? There's an emergence that we're actually seeing among clinical psychologists of what they are calling COVID anxiety syndrome. And that's not just the natural tendency to put a name on everything. It's a serious business. We find people are suffering from clinical anxiety. And that is directly attributable to what people have been experiencing during the coronavirus pandemic. 43% of adults, they've experienced a lot of loneliness during the lockdowns. Loneliness is at epidemic levels, according to our Surgeon General Vivek Murthy. He's written a book on the subject, and he says that it is one of the biggest problems psychologically that we have in the United States today, and it has been accelerated, exacerbated massively by the pandemic. Depression. Clinical depression symptoms have risen by a factor of 3 over the past year. And aside from everything else, I'll speak to you frankly as an economist if you can stand it, JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, estimates that the economic impact of the emotional problems coming from the coronavirus lockdowns, quarantines, loneliness, isolation, you name it, is more than $1.5 trillion in medical expenses and lost productivity. This, my friends, is trauma. Now, some of you watching this, you've lost loved ones. Some of you have gotten sick. Some of you have lost your job. Some of you have lost businesses. That's really tangible, but most of you haven't, blessedly. But you've experienced a hardship too. Fear, disappointment, loneliness. If we want post-traumatic growth, we need to do 3 things. Number 1, we need to manage our feelings. Now maybe that sounds weird to you. How can I manage my feelings? My feelings are something that happened to me. No, you can, you should. And there's huge promise if you do. Second, you need to beware the world's solutions to this problem. The solutions that people give to you for your isolation and loneliness. Why? Because they're commercial solutions and they don't have your best interest at heart. The true solutions come from within. And my third lesson is that when change finds you, you need to lean into it. Because if you don't, you won't get the benefit. But if you do, you're going to love what you find. People treat feelings, as I mentioned before, as just a phenomenon. They're in the ether. They happen to us. And there's a reason that we feel this way. Feelings are processed by a very ancient part of the brain called the limbic system. This was evolved more than 1 million years ago, before we had our conscious minds the way that we understand them today. It's something that exists because we need our feelings to be processed automatically because they keep us alive. Often psychologists will call this, social scientists will call this the lizard brain because it's primitive. Now, this is a wonderful thing because it gives us our basic positive and negative emotions, which we rely on all day. Our basic positive emotions are love and joy, and here's the really wonderful one, interest. If you're a fan of the Aspen Ideas Festival, it's because watching talks and thinking about ideas and having big conversations, it gives you a good feeling. It gives you pleasure. Why? Because interest is a basic positive emotion processed automatically. If you like what we're talking about here, you're interested in my talk, you have a basic positive emotion that's happening from this. That's a wonderful part of being human. There are also basic negative emotions, which we don't like, but which we need. The basic negative emotions are sadness and anger and disgust and fear. We hate them because they feel bad, but give thanks for your negative emotions. They are truly what have allowed your ancestors to pass on their genes. Were it not for negative emotions, threat would hunt us down. Threat is actually something that gives us negative emotions and allows us to avoid the sources of threat. These are your force field, your shield, your defenses against bad things that could hurt you. They keep us alive. They make us miserable. That's the paradox, isn't it? We need to learn to manage our negative emotions, not to get rid of them. This is a case study in emotional management. How do you manage your feelings? How do you manage any feelings problem? It's actually a 3-step process. Here's what we want to do. When your feelings are happening to you, they're existing in the limbic system of the brain, that deep part of the brain. You can't manage something that's automatic, obviously. To manage your thoughts, you need to move them to your prefrontal cortex, where your executive function is happening. You need to move feelings from one part of your brain to another. Now, there are lots of ways to think about this. The ancient Buddhist idea of observing your feelings is doing exactly this. Once you get away from your feelings happening to you and you say, I'm going to treat these feelings like they were happening to somebody else. How interesting. I'm feeling angry right now. I realize I'm feeling sad. What you've just done is to make your feelings metacognitive. They're no longer happening to you. They're happening alongside of your conscious brain. And you've moved the idea of these feelings from the limbic system to the prefrontal cortex. Step 2, you go from metacognition to analysis. Now that you're able to observe your feelings, you can analyze what's really going on. Consider why a feeling exists. Why am I feeling sad? Why am I feeling angry or disgusted? Why am I afraid? That's an analysis as if you were an outside observer. Oh, what a miracle to be a human. There is no other animal on the planet, no species that's ever existed that we know of, where we can actually observe ourselves. We can be aware of being aware. We can be aware of being aware of being aware. It's really amazing. And finally, and this is really where it becomes practical and good for us, we manage the emotions actively. How? We accept our feelings. We resolve not to let them bind our actions in an inappropriate or destructive way. And we turn them into an opportunity. This is the three-step process where you manage you. So now let's do it in the case of something we might have been suffering, something that I've been suffering. I bet you have too. Uncertainty is a big problem for us, or it certainly has been over the past 16 months. You've asked yourself, probably, am I going to get sick? Maybe you were really, really afraid of it. Maybe you weren't, but it had to cross your mind. You asked yourself, will I lose somebody that I love? Will I lose my job? Will I lose my business? Will the stock market go crazy and will I lose my retirement? We've all had these ideas. I'll never go back to the university. I'll never go back to the office. I'll never see other human beings. You know, we have a tendency to catastrophize everything. Why? Because uncertainty does that to us. Well, what is uncertainty? Uncertainty is nothing more than fear. Fear is the master emotion, and it must be. If you feel fear, it better clear the decks from everything else. If you're having a great time as a caveman, you don't pay attention to the saber-toothed tiger sneaking up behind you. You will be lunch. You won't pass on your genes. Thank goodness for fear. And it does all sorts of amazing things that saves our lives today. Let's say that you're walking across the street in New York City or wherever you live, and this has happened to all of us. You're in the crosswalk, but you almost get hit by a car. Well, what happens in that moment? The visual stimulus of the car coming toward you is processed in your visual cortex at the back of your brain. It sends a signal to the amygdala, which is part of the limbic system. The amygdala sends out an immediate signal through the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, which signals to the adrenal glands to pump out cortisol and epinephrine, aka adrenaline. This happens in 74 milliseconds. 74 1/100ths of a second. This is 3 or 4 seconds before you know what's going on with your prefrontal cortex. You've jumped out of the way and your heart's pounding like crazy and you're a little bit angry and you're sweating and you've probably already flipped the guy off before you even know what's going on. Fear saved your life. Be grateful for fear, but manage it. See, fear is a response to threat. Uncertainty stimulates constant, mild, gnawing fear. Now, physiologically, let's remember what this is doing. If you have a lot of uncertainty in your life, what's going on? Ordinarily, it means there's a bunch of unknown outcomes with probabilities that you don't know either, and therefore contingencies that you can't manage. What is this all about? This is basically a phantasm behind you, a fear of a threat behind you that's small and it's kind of hunting you all the time. That's how uncertainty works. You know that feeling where I know something's bothering me, I can't remember what it is right now, but I know something is ruining my day. It's almost always uncertainty, and this is what people have been suffering. And the result is kind of a little drip of stress hormones, a little drip of cortisol, drip, drip, drip. Don't avoid uncertainty, don't ignore uncertainty, don't try to block it out, because you'll get unintended secondary consequences. The uncertainty will pop out in some area of our life, which will clamp down in terms of what we try to manage. When we have uncertainty, there's unknown outcomes, unknown probabilities, unmanaged contingencies, which is why we have fear. Risk, on the other hand, has known outcomes, estimated probabilities, and therefore managed contingencies. That's the reason that insurance exists. Insurance is literally a happiness business because it converts uncertainty to risk. How do we try to do that in our ordinary lives? If I can get enough information, then I'm going to know the possible outcomes, I can estimate the probabilities, and I can take action. Well, guess what? When there's something that's as uncertain as the pandemic was, you can't do that. Here are your uncertainty action steps. Let's call this the uncertainty management steps. Number 1 is metacognition. Remember, observe your feeling. I'm experiencing fear from uncertainty. Step 2 is analysis. I can't avoid this uncertainty. I can't convert it into risk. So I need to manage it. This is how all of us should deal with traumas and pain and sacrifice and trouble, small and large. Is we should start every day by neutralizing the uncertainty, managing our feelings by saying, I don't know what's going to happen this week or next week or next year, or over the next 10 years. I don't know. It's uncertain. But one thing I truly know is that I am alive and well this day. This day is a gift. I will not waste the gift that is this day. Early on, I noticed after a couple of months of lockdowns, it's great being with my family, don't get me wrong, but the lack of contact with new people, new conversations, even strangers, it made me feel almost physically uncomfortable, like there was a pane of glass between me and the outside world. I was lacking a key neurotransmitter, a neuropeptide that functions as a hormone, if you're keeping track of the technical parts, called oxytocin. This is in the vernacular known as the love molecule. Why? It's produced by the human brain in response to two things: eye contact and touch. You crave it. It is intensely pleasurable. And it's a wonderful part of human evolution, actually, because it bonds us to other people in ways that make us, as far as we're concerned, fully human. You get the biggest burst of oxytocin when you lay eyes for the first time on your newborn child. So what's the problem when you don't get enough of it? You feel uncomfortable, you feel restless. It can be almost physically painful. And that's what a lot of people have experienced. Why? Not enough eye contact, not enough touch. So what do we do? What do we do? Well, the world has got solutions to this. The world has got commercial solutions to make you feel better. What do they look like? They look like this: staring into a computer screen, making eye contact, so it seems, or at least making social contact with other people. There's been a huge explosion in the use of social media over the past 16 months, and not just among people in their teens and 20s. On the contrary, people my age too have gone from minutes a day to hours a day on Facebook and Twitter and even Instagram. Here's the problem: it doesn't work. No eye contact, no touch. It promises everything. It delivers next to nothing. There's a wonderful body of research that's largely spearheaded by Jean Twenge, who's a social psychologist at San Diego State University, that shows that anything more than about an hour a day of social media across all platforms, you'll get lonelier the longer you're on it. Does that make sense? Lonelier the longer you're on social media? How can that be? Think about it this way. Social media functions as the junk food of social contact. And all that'll happen is too many calories and not enough nutrients. You will get lonelier while you're actually consuming too much. So what do we need to do instead? How do we protect ourselves from this loneliness, from this social junk food? And the answer comes, and it always does, from within. This doesn't cost money. This doesn't require you turning on your computer. This takes no tech at all. This requires that to feel fully human, we have to act fully human. Here are reliable oxytocin boosters that are free because they come from within. Number one is more eye contact. Now, one of the interesting behavioral phenomena that we see during the coronavirus lockdowns is pandemic, during the isolation, just kind of living in our little bubble. Most of us, some people are living alone, but most people are not. Most people over the past 16 months have lived with other people. The problem is that their behavior hasn't changed from before the pandemic. If you live with somebody that you see every day, your spouse or your children, you can be like ships passing in the night. You're not purposively making eye contact with somebody. You talk to somebody while you're looking at your phone or at a book or whatever, and you have to do it on purpose. Remember, metacognition, analysis, management. You need to go from I'm experiencing loneliness to taking it into your own hands by changing your behavior on purpose. The second is touch. We have casual touch all day long with a lot of people. But once again, with the people that we're living with, that really the only people that we see during the circumstances that we've had over the past year and a half, there's not that much out of the ordinary in our touching, and it all adds up to not enough. It turns out that canines and humans and Homo sapiens we've evolved in parallel to complement each other in all sorts of wonderful ways. You ever feel like your dog loves you? Biologically, your dog loves you because when you make eye contact with and touch your dog gets a 56% boost in blood oxytocin levels, which is equivalent to being madly in love with somebody and staring into their eyes. This is kind of Paul Zach's bailiwick, and he's great in this work. And one of the things that he's estimated is how to maximize blood oxytocin levels, 22 seconds of contact, a 22-second embrace. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You need a 22-second hug, and you need it therapeutically every 2 hours from the people that you live with, from the people around you. It's going to transform your personality. It's going to do amazing things to you. And as important as anything else, this is your reliable interior self-management solution. Beware the outside commercial world. Embrace the internal you that gives the truth. At the beginning of the coronavirus epidemic, it was just going to be a few weeks. And then it turned into 6 months and then a year. And then it kind of dawned on us. This was supposed to be a disruption. It's actually a transition. We hate transition. But transition is a normal part of life. One of the things that I point out to my students at Harvard is that you were born during the fall of the Soviet Union, which was a tectonically important transition in world affairs and geopolitics. It was never supposed to happen. Foreign policy has never been the same. 10 years later was 9/11. That was a trauma. A decade later, we had the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and fast forward 10 more years, that got the coronavirus. Every 10 years, there's a massive, unwelcome collective transition, and this is interspersed with your private transitions. According to the data, every 18 months or so, there's going to be a transition in your life, usually involuntary and therefore unwelcome. Transition is part of life. Change is part of life. How can we be more resilient for the next time? Again, this is one of the promises of post-traumatic growth. If we can get to the root of our discomfort now with this transition, we're positioned for all kinds of good things going forward. It goes back to evolution once again. Negativity bias is what we call it. When you're seeing a transition in your life, you always look for the bad parts of it. Why? One of the reasons that you've survived is because of the negativity bias that surrounds transitions and changes in your life. If you wait long enough and you embrace change, and you get something else called fading affect bias. What's that? Fading affect bias means you forget the little discomforts, you forget the threats, you start to embrace the benefits that came to you from the learning that came during the change, during the transition, maybe during the pain and sacrifice, maybe during the trauma itself. Now, the period of transition is uncomfortable, but the learning comes because of what we call liminality. Liminality is the space between two equilibria in your life. And what we find is that this is the period of most intense creativity and growth. Think about it in your own life. Think about it when you were going from college to your first job, and that period that was, you were learning about yourself and you disliked it, but you think back on it now and how it made you who you are. You understood yourself better. When I talk to people about the epidemic, that the conversations they always key in on two topics. About pre-pandemic, all the stuff that they liked and they miss. And then they talk about the things that they don't like during the pandemic, the disappointment, the missed things, the graduations, the weddings. But that's a missed opportunity to get the benefits from the liminality that this experience is bringing us. Talk about the pre-pandemic experiences and relationships and general phenomena in your life that you disliked and you want to leave behind, and make a strategy to leave them behind. What about the daily hassles? What about things of your job, or maybe your job itself, or the place where you live that didn't fulfill you? What about the unproductive or toxic relationships that you need to leave behind? And make a second list now of the things that you like from the pandemic. I know, net, you prefer not to have the pandemic. I got it, me too. But make a list of the things that you will miss. That after dinner walk, that time in your garden, that, coffee with your spouse, somebody that you love in the middle of the afternoon that you never would have gotten before. Make a list of those things and make a strategy to keep them. If you really want to grow and change, and you want it to be good for you, you want post-traumatic growth, then you need a strategy, a metacognitive strategy to do so. And that requires these lists. What will I leave behind that I don't miss? What will I keep that I actually liked? When I was a kid, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. I grew up in Seattle, Washington, and I was crazy about fishing. Well, along the way, after I'd been doing this for 2 hours, fruitlessly, I remember this day, not because of the picture, it's burned into my brain. This old wizened local mariner comes out of nowhere, seemingly. He comes up to me and says, "Hey kid, catching something?" I said, "No, nothing." He says, "Getting any bites?" I said, "No bites." He says, "Because you're doing it wrong." "What are you talking about? I'm doing it wrong." He says, "You're not fishing during the falling tide." Now, for those of you who don't live on the ocean, the falling tide is when the tide is going out especially quickly. That's a falling tide. He said, because during a falling tide, it looks like there's nothing that's going to stay. It's stirring up the plankton and bait fish, and the game fish are going berserk. We've half an hour, we're pulling out fish after fish. And he says, you know, kid, there's only one mistake you can make during a falling tide. And I said, what? He said, not having your line in the water. The coronavirus epidemic, or for that matter, any unwelcome change in your life, it feels like loss. It's really just the falling tide of life. That's the time when the bait fish are stirred up. Get your line into the water. How do you want to come out of the coronavirus epidemic? Better than you went in. How are you going to do that? You're going to manage your bad feelings? Because you're going to get more of them. Manage them now, enjoy that later. You're going to beware the world's wily and external commercial solutions and look within. And finally, lean into the changes that are hunting you, because those are the things that you really need the most. I didn't choose coronavirus. You didn't either. It chose us. My only choice is not whether I suffer from the coronavirus epidemic. It's how I choose to react to it. But we can look back on this time together as we emerge from the pandemic as a sacred time, as a sanctified time, as a beautiful time, because it helped us understand who we are and, most importantly, who we can be. I hope that you're happy. I hope that you're well with your family and your loved ones. I hope that these ideas have helped you. And I'm looking forward to sharing more ideas with you in the future. Thank you.